Welcome again to SethFM, a subsidiary of Seth Blogs, simulcast for the second time today on YouTube. I am as ever your host and guiding light, Seth McDonough. Today we'll once again be speaking to our friends at CBC Radio, who are so aggressively, progressively correct that they have trouble contemplating any possible counter-argument to their assumed truths. We'll be speaking with Tom Power, the host of CBC Radio's arts and culture show, Q, in regard to a cancellation of a major artistic production due to protests. Tom, can you take us away?
If you can't tell, they're chanting, "Give us back our stories." That's what the Montreal Jazz Festival has sounded like for the past few days.
Okay, notice that the protesters are using the phrase, "Give us back our stories," which of course is an allusion to the notion of cultural appropriation, or in this case, racial appropriation, wherein the argument is that a group of people should not be allowed to tell stories that feature another culture or even race, in particular if it's a minority culture or race, because those stories are considered to be the rightful property of the race or culture being described. Now, this is a significant claim to moral shame, and whether or not one agrees with it, I think it's impossible to deny that it comes with very serious moral implications. And since our host, Tom Power, is unable, due to instructions from his progressive betters, to point out some of these possible objections, I would like to preface his discussion with some of those objections here. Number one, race essentializing. Cultural appropriation theory claims in its bio to be an anti-racism doctrine, but it may in fact be having the opposite effect. In a perfect world, race would be as irrelevant to our judgment of each other as shoe size. But the racial wing of cultural appropriation theory tells us that race is essentially who we are. Number two, empathy blocking. Mark Twain tells us that travel is murder to one's prejudices. But cultural appropriation theory tells us to segregate by culture and race and not to explore concepts of people who seem different from us. Far from increasing our compassion, such cultural appropriation segregation teaches us to view each other as outsiders. Number three, insight prohibiting. If art helps us to make sense of life, then cultural appropriation limits that potential by limiting the number of people who are allowed to comment on certain concepts. Number four, racist. Cultural appropriation theory, race addition, tells us that by dint of your tint, you are ill-equipped and not allowed to explore certain concepts. Number five, artistically untenable. Limiting authors to telling stories of characters with matching demographics is artistically unworkable. Let's go to author Lionel Shriver, who said in a speech critiquing cultural appropriation, "Trying to push the boundaries of the author's personal experience is part of a fiction writer's job. Otherwise, all I could write about would be smart-alecky, 59-year-old, 5'2" white women from North Carolina." I agree with Ms. Shriver. The notion that the only well-developed characters of white authors must also be white is a moral fiasco. Number six, artistically limiting. Although cultural appropriation theory makes an exception for people who are members of minorities to tell stories of people from different races or cultures, such authors may nevertheless feel obligated to keep their stories to their own race and culture, because after all, if they don't, no one else is allowed to. Number seven, morally isolating. All cultures are eligible for moral struggles with the customs and practices that they have developed through the years. But cultural appropriation theory tells us that the only ones who are allowed to criticize such a culture are their own members. And this limits potential moral progress and happiness of the members of those culture who may gain benefit from insights of people from outside, from the free exchange of ideas. Okay, so with my criticisms of cultural appropriation theory, Tom, please continue.
Crowds have been protesting a new play called Slav, which had its premiere at the festival. It was billed as a theatrical odyssey based on slave songs, but it's performed by a majority white group of singers, including lead performer Betty Boniface, and led by a white director, Robert Lepage.
My instincts tend to agree that it is strange to have 5 white performers and only 2 black performers in a portrayal of black slaves. Nevertheless, in the interest of exploring ideas, I have 3 counterthoughts to my own discomfort. Counterthought number 1, musical exception. While Slave has theatrical elements, as far as I can tell, it is primarily a musical production. And music is mostly concerned with expressing ideas and emotions. And I think it is worrying to limit who can express such ideas and emotions purely based on race. Counterthought number 2, protagonist consideration. While the lead singer of Slave, Betty Boniface, is white, Katia Thoni, who portrays the protagonist of the story, is black. So essentially, I'm led to understand the show zooms in on her story, where her race matches the character being portrayed. Counterthought number 3, story value allowance. What I'm wondering is, let's say the producers of the show were unable to find the black singers of the genre they were seeking. Montreal, after all, I'm told by my local internet, is only 9% black. So if they weren't able to find the matching singers, is that racial exactitude more important than putting on a great work of art? I don't know the answer to that, and I probably wouldn't have had the courage to do it myself. But I wonder if critics are open to exploring that idea. A critic at the Montreal Gazette, Tacha Dunlevy, excuse the pronunciation if I got it wrong, Tacha said, "Yes, Boniface can sing. But rather than elevate the material, the theatrical contrivances only serve to expose the fact that this entire show is based on a flawed premise, that white people are altogether entitled to put on a musical theater review about black slavery." Mr. Dunlevy, your argument makes me second-guess my discomfort. Your phrase, "not entitled," is racially puritanical. As for cognitive dissonance, I feel it too. Nevertheless, if I were at such a show, I would hope that I would have the emotional imagination to see past color and to empathize with the suffering of the people being portrayed. Okay, so with those counter thoughts in place, I'll ask Tom to lead us in a discussion on this topic. And just a note, as ever, I will be editing for brevity, but not taking anyone out of context. Tom, please take us away.
When the Montreal Jazz Festival stood by the play, the local arts community took to the streets to speak out. This all led to the musician Moses Sumney canceling his set at the festival on Tuesday. And then just yesterday, the Montreal Jazz Festival axed all remaining performances of Slave.
Okay, so our situation is set. A major artistic production has been canceled due to protest. And that is a serious result that surely deserves sober second thought from CBC Radio's Arts and Culture show. Tom, go ahead.
Pierre Quenders is one of the people protesting the new play. And here's the thing. He's also a musician who you've maybe heard on Q, and he was scheduled to play at the festival tomorrow night.
Tom, just a reminder that as the host of a show on Canada's publicly funded broadcaster, that you have an obligation to ask some critical questions in regard to such a serious topic as this.
You were at the protest. How do you feel about the decision to pull the show down?
I can be happier. When we decide to do these kind of things, we need to, first of all, take the time to think and to think of the decision that we're making and the people that will be affected by it. And this is something that I think the Jazz Fest didn't really do.
Hi, Pierre. Seth here, SethFM. Now, I don't know if you're right about the jazz festival's lack of consideration for how their art might affect people, but I don't think it's healthy for artists to be required to seek permission from certain people before they can explore concepts.
It is a little too late for them to cancel the show because it took them, I would say, even 6 months because a friend of mine who's a journalist named Marie-Lou Kraft have been talking about this since last fall.
Okay, Pierre, that is a strange argument. So you're saying as soon as a journalist objects to an artistic production, the artist responsible for it must immediately desist? Is that really your testimony?
And she was mentioning that this could not be possible, that we're going to have a show like this in Montreal during the Jazz Fest, talking about slave songs and not having any black people represented in the play, or only 2.
Again, I agree that the 2 out of 7 is strange, and conventional moral wisdom says that it's wrong. Nevertheless, I wonder if your expert accuser, who must be obeyed, is open to discussion. Is race essential to character? And is that link more important than the possibility of telling a great story?
The Montreal Jazz Festival said this in a statement. We would like to apologize to those who were hurt. It was not our intention at all. Pierre, what do you make of that?
This is a total change of speech, and I really think the fact that Moses Sumney canceled his show and it was covered by international media, that's probably the main reason.
Agreed that the show probably gave in to progressive pressure as opposed to their own moral change of heart. So I wonder, given that we agree that they backed down from pressure, if that gives us any insight into political power and how much the progressively correct currently have.
If this wasn't talked about outside of Quebec, nobody at the Jazz Fest would have canceled this. We have to be realistic here.
So, Pierre, is your argument that artists should immediately cancel productions even when they don't think they're doing anything wrong, just on the say-so of protesters and critics?
It is just sad because it's as if artists like us here, local artists, we don't have the power to convince those people when they're doing something wrong.
Pierre, I don't want to overstate this, but you sound quite authoritarian. So you really do believe that as soon as an artist is criticized, they should immediately cancel production, regardless of their own good faith beliefs in their work?
You mentioned this isn't the first statement from the Montreal Jazz Festival. When they were still standing by Slav, when they were still standing by the play, they released a statement saying, before subjecting the play to trial by public opinion, we firmly believe that we must wait and witness the show. They will be present to us all. Pierre Quenders, what did you make of that?
I like the question, Tom. It shows a hint of a morsel of curiosity about this important topic, by quoting, but not having to align yourself with the initial defense that the Jazz Fest had of their artistic production. So, Pierre, what do you think? Is there any room for criticizing a piece of art without calling for it to be banned?
Didn't get it. I was like, this is bullshit, you have to realize that was wrong.
Pierre, remind you never to take a moral philosophy class. I think you would find all the exploring and discussing and debating of ideas to be rather boring, since you obviously have the correct answer to all questions, which is apparently simply to follow the current moral wisdom and nobody gets hurt.
You're doing a show about slave songs, and you don't have enough people or Afro-descendant people telling that story, explaining that story.
Again, the 5 out of 7 portrayers surprised me too. But Pierre, your phrasing is odd. You're saying explaining that story, which seems to refer to the artist or the director. And so again, you seem to be racially essentializing artists, as though by definition a person of a certain pigment is best equipped to tell a story of people from history who had matching pigment. And by definition, someone without matching pigment could not possibly have the requisite empathy or historical understanding to explore those topics.
So you have to be blind at some point to now realize that this is wrong. That first statement was just wrong, and any other statement that Betty Boniface and Robert Lepage gave online, saying that they don't see color, it's color blindness. You shouldn't be blind of color when it's a subject this deep.
Yeah, in this case, it may have been tone deaf to be color blind. But are you open to artists exploring boundaries? As you know, many productions will take work that was written centuries ago and they'll reset it in a new time. Recently, some productions have been exploring gender, where they'll put a female performer in a male role. Now, you may not like these changes, but are they so harmful that you must stop them from happening? Is it possible just to criticize these productions and then let the audience decide for themselves what they think?
There's still a trauma that people are living on a daily basis because of slavery here in America. Also here in Quebec, and people in Quebec here can't still today they're now able to admit that there was slavery here.
If Quebec society is indeed ignorant of historical slavery, do you think the best way to rectify that problem is to limit who is allowed to put on art about said slavery?
Obviously, there's been a lot of hurt and disappointment around this. How do you think the Montreal Jazz Festival should move on?
And that was Tom Power's final question of our rather dogmatic friend, Pierre Quinders. His only resistance to Pierre was to quote the maligned show's initial defense of itself.
They need a better team. I'm not saying that they need to change their team, but they need to have the best tools and have people do the research.
So, Pierre, how would you like this to work? Is there an evidence-based panel that you would like artists to be referred to when they're considering ideas? Would you like this applied to your art, where the expert critics can weigh in and actually decide, based on your skin tone, whether you can go ahead with certain artistic ideas?
When you have people protesting about a show, first of all, you have to listen. You have to take the time to listen and see what exactly you did wrong. We have a responsibility here to ask ourselves questions and also listen to people and accept the evidence.
Yeah, I think it's worthwhile to listen to one's critics and one's protesters. But Pierre, you seem to be arguing that such critics are infallible. And do you really think that's an artistically healthy relationship, that whenever a critic speaks up, an artist must shut up?
And also, there was such a lack of respect of the Black community with this by the Jazz Fest and by the people organizing this show. So I hope in the future they will do better.
First of all, when you say respect, are you sure you don't mean compliance? Second, I think it's quite silly to suggest that there is an opinion of the Black community. Black people, like all other people, have a diversity of points of view.
In their last statement, they're saying that the Jazz Fest is about bringing all the community together, and they made a mistake. And I hope they will, from now on, they will really do what they are saying that they're going to do, and bringing all the community together and representing all the community as they should be representing.
I'm not sure what you mean by representation there, but I get the sense that you're arguing that artists must seek the advice of certain communities when exploring certain ideas. And I think that's quite dangerous to suggest that an artist must use certain pre-approved concepts if they're going to look at certain topics.
Pierre Quinders, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you for having me, Tom.
I appreciate that. We'll see you again soon.
Tom, in one of your interviews, your guest asked you what your prime motivating value was. And you said the search for truth. And so I wonder if you could try just a little bit harder to live up to that claim by occasionally asking your guests critical questions when they make profound statements about the nature of morality and artistic freedom. And then instead of just signaling your truth-seeking virtue, you may start to exemplify it. For everyone else, if you'd like to signal your virtue, please hit the like button below. I don't know exactly where it is. Good day and good luck.